From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and coming up today, K-State's Romulo Lollato will talk about the wheat planting delays in Kansas because of the recent wet weather and adjustments that you producers might make to improve the tillering potential of late-planted wheat. He'll also talk about the sharply cold temperatures of late, how those may have impacted wheat that had already been seeded. Then from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center at K-State, Brian Briggeman will talk about the current state of agricultural cooperatives in Kansas as this is National Cooperative Month. Brian joins us from South Africa, where he's currently studying agricultural cooperative operations there. And later on, K-State's Charlie Lee will talk about a new report on bow hunting as a means of controlling deer populations. All that here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome to another Agriculture Today. We'll step back and take a broad look now at our issues currently with winter wheat planting in Kansas. As you're all well aware, moisture to excess in many locations has slowed planting progress to a halt, raising questions about what will happen afterward with late-planted wheat and what a producer might do to compensate in that case. Romulo Lollato with us, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. He's been extremely active planting test plots for K-State the last week and a half, 2 weeks, and is out of the field now like everybody else. So this does raise some questions about the possible productivity of the crop when it's planted late, right, Romulo?
It definitely does, Eric. It definitely does. And I guess just like all the wheat producers out there in our own crew here, as you mentioned, we typically put out 4,000 to 5,000 plots, and we are all over the state, right? And right now I can say that we are 40% done, so I'm kind of anxious and getting nervous and wanting to be out there, so just like our wheat producer out there. But all this rainfall that we actually had since about October 1st, it has really been holding us back, especially in the central part of the state. So if we look at the total amount of rainfall that we've had since October 1st, really far northwest Kansas, I think they're in good shape. They got anywhere from 1 to 2 inches, perhaps a little bit more over the weekend now. But last that I looked up to Friday, they have had close to 2 inches, and that gives you almost a perfect stand, right? It gives you enough moisture to just get the crop up and also build a little bit of that profile as well. So it might be in pretty good shape. Once we start moving to north central, and especially south central Kansas, then we had regions there that in these last 12 days or so got as much as 12, 13 inches of rainfall. And so really had the potential to keep producers out of the fields until it dries out. And as you mentioned, definitely decreasing that the yield potential of the crop if we get past our optimum planting window.
And that optimum window does shift, of course, from north to south. Later and later it goes. But there are those areas now where it'll be on the back end of that planting window when producers finally get in the field.
Definitely, especially if we think north central Kansas and even central Kansas. I'm not as concerned with south central yet at this point. That's where our window runs perhaps the longest. But really, if we look at north central Kansas, perhaps part of northwest even, we are almost passing the optimal planting window already, right? And in many of those cases, producers still have soybeans on the field, which means that they need to harvest several acres of soybean before they can actually come and plant their wheat crop. So they need to wait until the soybean dries out enough for them to be out there and harvesting that soybeans. And that's going to be another delaying factor to our wheat crop.
We should bring in as well, it's not just the moisture. We've had awfully cold weather in Kansas the last several evenings likewise, and the daytime temperatures have been a little crisp too. You have to figure that into what's happening or likely to happen, right?
Sure. So the effect of those cold temperatures, they are several-fold, right? One of them, for the fields that are already planted, well, they may take much longer to emerge. right? So I guess we can talk about two different conditions here. One for the fields that are already planted and one for the fields that are to be planted. So the consequences there is perhaps we planted that crop, it never made it through the soil surface yet. Those cooler temperatures are going to delay that emergence, right? We're going to delay the development of that crop just simply for being colder. And the longer that crop is exposed to those conditions, the less viability we might have on the coleoptile. If we start getting longer than maybe a week or 10 days and we are not seeing the crop emerge yet, I start to concern with the viability of that coleoptile. And also we're more exposed to perhaps early season fungal diseases, right? Because there will be moisture, there will be cool conditions that may favor some of those early season fungal diseases. For the crops that are not planted yet, these colder temperatures and the colder temperatures are going to make it harder for the soil or longer for the soil to dry out before we can either cut the soybeans or before we can actually get into and plant some of the acres that we have not planted yet.
The big issue in the end here is whether or not that crop will tiller sufficiently, whether we're talking about delays in planting or being slowed down by cold temperatures. That is what's being watched very closely, right?
Yes, definitely. So these delays and these colder temperatures, right, they, as you mentioned, they're also going to decrease or potentially decrease the number of tillers that the crop puts out now during the fall. And those fall tillers, they're typically more productive, right? So we typically want to go into the winter with at least 3, 4, maybe even 5 well-formed tillers. Those tillers, they have the highest yield potential of the tillers that can be formed in the plant. Spring-formed tillers, they can still contribute to the yield potential, but typically with smaller heads and perhaps not as productive as these fall tillers. So definitely, if temperatures from here on, they remain cold, there is a chance that we're going to have less tillering, right, especially in late planted fields. And that lower tillering in the fall typically corresponds to decreased yield potential.
What can the producer do to hopefully compensate for these conditions that could eat away at the yield potential of that stand? And there are a handful of things that producers might consider, starting with seeding rate for those who have not planted yet and are still waiting to get that opportunity to take the drill to the field.
Yes, so there are different things that we can do to help that crop. So try to think of it putting yourself in the perspective of the crop, right? You're being planted late, you have colder temperatures, you don't have the strength or the temperatures to produce as many tillers. So one way to compensate that is with seeding rates. So there has been several research projects at K-State that have shown that as you delay planting date, you need to bump up those seeding rates, right? Perhaps for every week that you're delaying past your optimal seeding date, considering increasing 10 or even 15% your seeding rates could be very helpful. And again, it comes back to the limited potential for tiller that we have on these late planted crops. So we're putting more seeds out there. You're going to have more main plants, so you don't rely on those tillers as much. So that's why typically planting late, increasing seeding rates as compared to your seeding rate in your optimal planting date is typically warranted, typically a good practice as we delay planting dates.
So that's step number one to consider, but there are other things too, including, you say, making sure that newly seeded wheat has adequate phosphorus accessible at the start.
Yes, so that starter fertilizer, right? So whenever we're providing fertilizer with the seed, phosphorus, and typically some of these fertilizers, if you're using MESZ or if you're using DAP, they also have some nitrogen with them. So if you're adding maybe 50 units of DAP or of MESZ, or in the end you're looking for 20 to 30 units of phosphorus with that seed as a starter fertilizer, that really, really helps increase our fall tillering. Think of that as a jump start to the crop, right? It's really going to provide that early fertility and help the crop try to tiller as much as it can, right? We have done a lot of research, and these in-furrow fertilizers, they really increase biomass production. So if you think of it, we're planting late, that's typically one of the situations where it would be money in the bank to put that in-furrow phosphorus fertilizer. We're planting late, you're trying to give the plant the highest chance that it has to tiller as much as it can.
What else can be done to help a late-planted wheat stand? Well, you hinted at this a moment ago. That stand can be vulnerable to disease, so a fungicide seed treatment might be in order, you say.
Yeah, so the research that we have done with fungicide seed treatments, the response is really dependent. I mean, it's really variable year to year, right? We have years where we have a very large or a relatively large response to fungicide seed treatment, and we have years that we have none, right? So in most years, we see it as almost as an insurance that you're going to have a good stand. Now, the years when we typically see the highest response in yield to that fungicide seed treatment is years like this one, where we're planting late, we're planting perhaps into cold conditions, very moist conditions and cold conditions that might increase the chances that we have for seed decay due to soil-borne diseases or on seedling plants as well. So again, these years where we're planting late and we have a very high probability that some of those weaker plants are not going to make, that's typically when we see the greatest response to that fungicide seed treatment.
All right. We are dwelling on the negative a bit here, but there is, in closing, Romulo, a positive. Producers will be planting to moisture in most, if not all, of the state, and that's always a plus when it comes to getting a stand off on the right foot.
Definitely. I think we've been talking about the negatives, but for sure, planting into moisture and achieving, in western Kansas, achieving a good stand is actually almost, I shouldn't say half, but it's a big proportion of your crop. So we're achieving a pretty good stand with some profile moisture, right? So that's extremely positive, especially as we move west. And from the temperature perspective, these cooler temperatures, they can also help control some of those wheat curl mite populations. So if you remember a couple of years back that we had very widespread infestation of wheat streak mosaic. So these colder temperatures can also help to some extent suppress those issues.
Romulo, many thanks to you as always.
Thank you very much, Eric. And producers who are on social media and would like more information about the wheat crop, not only now but throughout the growing season, make sure and follow me either on Twitter or Facebook, and either one will be at KSU Wheat.
Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, on this opening part of Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. This month of October has been designated, as you might know, National Cooperative Month. Cooperatives are instrumental, of course, in our agricultural structure here in the state of Kansas. We visit for a few moments with the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University, but this conversation is long distance as we talk with Brian Briggeman. He is in South Africa at the moment. Brian, thanks for meeting up with the time difference to chat with us right here. And before we go any further, what's your assignment there in South Africa currently?
Well, it's good to talk with you, Eric, especially here in October, Cooperative Month. I am currently working at Stellenbosch University. It's in the Western Cape province of South Africa. It's probably about an hour drive from Cape Town. I'm working with the agri-science faculty. It's been a unique experience, working on a lot of different things, getting to know the folks here, but also too, working with some cooperatives that are here in South Africa. So I think a few things that I've picked up along the way that I can bring back when I come back home and deliver through some research programs and educational programs.
Excellent. And we do want to, in a few moments, take a second to compare and contrast what you're seeing in agricultural cooperatives in South Africa to what we see commonly here in Kansas. But wanted to ask you generally the state of agricultural cooperatives in Kansas here in 2018 as you interact regularly with our agricultural co-ops. What's the landscape look like out there right now?
Well, right now for many of our farmer co-ops in Kansas, it's pretty similar, kind of like with the farm economy. It's challenging and have to be watched. The competitiveness that's out there right now to continue to deliver value to customers, to keep and maintain customers, it's pretty strong. So that does create some challenges, but also create some opportunities as well for those co-ops to go out there and to continue to push and deliver value back to their farmer owners. So I think as we see this year progress and get through this fall harvest, but right now for cooperatives, it's a challenging time. They have to keep, their eye on their financials to ensure the safety and soundness of, their balance sheet going forward. But again, like I said, there are opportunities that are out there to continue to add value back to their farmer owners.
Expand on that, if you would. What would be the primary value-added opportunities as cooperatives interact with their patrons and their customers?
Well, every farmer out there right now is very aware of the amount of costs and inputs that they're utilizing, to raise a crop. So where you see a lot of these opportunities for these cooperatives to add value back to their farmer owners is really through technology. As we're in a tight margin environment for these farmers, it's really imperative for the cooperatives to, find ways, innovative ways to drive profit per acre up, whether it's through precision technologies to enhance overall yield and minimize costs so that we can drive more profit per acre. So there are a number of cooperatives that I've been working with or have sat down with who have spent a lot of time thinking about that because that's a real opportunity to add value back to their farmer owners.
We always talk as well about the structure of our cooperative systems in Kansas and consolidation. We've seen a lot of that. And is that a trend that has hit a plateau now, or will it continue? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't feel that it has plateaued. If you look back over time, when we see periods of mergers and acquisitions as consolidation pick up, it's when the farm economy is tough. And certainly, things out there from a net farm income perspective, it's challenging out there. So I don't feel that we've plateaued on the consolidation. I feel that we'll continue to see that happen. In Kansas, it happens, through a merger, kind of a traditional merger, bringing the two companies together. We've also seen a trend of various LLCs being created where you have the LLC provides the management infrastructure, if you will, to the various cooperatives. So it's a different form of consolidation that we see in Kansas. But, if you were to pin me down and say, well, where are we heading exactly? I don't know what that right magical number is. But, given the trends within production agriculture at the farmer level, at the agribusiness level, there are still some gains to be made, some economies of scale, and even to a certain extent, economies of scope, advantages from additional consolidation. So, no, I don't think it's plateaued. I do think we'll continue to see that trend. But again, if that does occur with maybe your local cooperative or one of your listeners out there, those board of directors, they have plenty of resources available to them. It's something that is well researched, it's well thought out. And at the end of the day, if that does happen, it's to drive value back to the membership, to find new ways to add value back to them.
Very well. Well, in our remaining time, again, want to find out what you're discovering about agricultural cooperatives in another country, as you're based there in South Africa for several weeks now. And you say you are, in fact, interacting with a cooperative there. What are the similarities and differences when you compare that structure to what we typically find in Kansas, Brian?
One of the things, that I will also mention here too is that if you are interested in learning about some of these co-ops that I'm working with down here in South Africa, go to the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center's Facebook page. I'm sharing some different videos and different discussions that I'm having on there. But to answer your question, similarities and differences, there really are two types of co-ops that I've worked with. Both are agricultural farmer cooperatives. The one co-op that I'll start with that we're putting on the Facebook page is very, very different than farmer co-ops that you would see in Kansas. In fact, it's a farmer co-op called Subrok Grain Farmers Cooperative, and it's a co-op of 4 emerging farmers here in South Africa. So pretty small in terms of their overall size, but it's a very successful co-op. And in many ways, working with them, it's kind of a window into the past of many of our co-ops back in Kansas when they first got their start and how, the cooperative model worked for them. Here in particular in Subrok, the co-op is primarily was started to defray some of the high costs of modern machinery. That's an interesting story and a good case study. There's another cooperative here called SSK, and it's a very developed cooperative. In fact, looks very similar to many of the co-ops that we would see back in Kansas and in the United States. And one of the things that's interesting with them, their approach to growth. How do they grow in, a developing country? How do we continue to give access to global markets, even domestic markets? Also, where they're growing this SSK, they do not have access to debt capital nearly as easily as we do back in the United States, through our financial system, the farm credit system. So the interesting thing that I'm through discussions with them is their approach to growth and how do they go about it and how do they find ways to do that. In a large part, the way that they do that is through various subsidiary companies that they invest in that reaches further down the value chain for their farmer owners. Without getting into a lot of detail, they raise a lot of canola in their area, and they invested in a company called Soil, which I toured the company Soil, where they crush the canola, make canola oil, mayonnaise, all of that, bottle it, everything right there. So it's just an interesting case study of how they deploy their members' capital in a way into a subsidiary that reaches and extends down the value chain.
It's been a rewarding experience, it sounds, Brian, by and large.
Yes, it's been very rewarding to be here, kind of experience a different type of agriculture and, just kind of have a chance to explore some other opportunities. Like I said before, here with doing some research and education, but also some additional funding opportunities that can come back to the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center.
And as Brian says, do check out the information about his trip at the Cooperative Center's Facebook page. Just look for Arthur Capper Cooperative Center there. Brian, thanks for taking the time from your hectic agenda there at the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Looking forward to seeing you once again back here in the States soon. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Brian Briggeman with us. He is the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center, housed in the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University. And we'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Now, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN, beginning with this week's Kansas Crop Condition and Harvest Progress Report from the USDA. And this as of this past Sunday, as you might expect, very few days suitable for field work, one exactly, according to the USDA last week. Topsoil moisture supplies in the state, 35% surplus now and 61% adequate, 4% short to very short, and subsoil moisture at 19% surplus and 72% adequate, only 9% short to very short. Winter wheat planting in Kansas, 62% complete, just a shade higher than last week, near the average for the date, and emergence is at 44%, again, very near the average. The corn harvest at 63%, near average. Soybean harvest, though, 16%, well behind the 33% average for the day, and the sorghum harvest at 19%, again, well behind the 28% average for the date. For a look now at the national corn and soybean harvest progress numbers, here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Rain and snow in the Midwest have not affected the progress of much of the nation's corn crop.
At this point, 96% of the U.S. corn fully mature by October 14th, and that is well ahead of the 5-year average of 91% and last year's 89%.
That was USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
However, with all of the rain and the snow mixing in the upper Midwest, corn harvest virtually at a standstill in the western Corn Belt. The harvest progress number is now up to 39%, which remarkably is still ahead of the 5-year average of 35%.
He says only 5% of harvest progress was achieved nationwide.
We see the corn condition generally stable at this time of year. 68% good to excellent, 12% very poor to poor. That is no change from last week. So we're not seeing the corn quality compromised at this point.
Soybeans are maturing ahead of schedule.
We see complete maturity in almost all fields, 95% of the soybeans dropping leaves by October 14th, 3 points ahead of the 5-year average, 2 points ahead of last year.
Rippey says harvest activity is not impressive.
Only inching forward 6 percentage points during the week to reach 38% overall, and that is significantly behind the 5-year average of 53% for October 14th, and even behind last year.
He notes a slight deterioration in condition.
We've had anecdotal reports of some quality issues with the soybeans in those wet and cold areas. Nationally, we see just a slight drop in the overall condition, now sitting at 66% good to excellent, down a point from last week. Very poor to poor ratings, now at 11% of the crop. That's up a point from last week.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And a 5-year exemption from certain hours of service requirements for livestock haulers, along with flexibility related to the new fatigue management practices, was requested in a petition submitted by U.S. farm and commodity organizations to the Department of Transportation. Current rules limit haulers to a drive time of 11 hours daily and total on-duty hours to 14. The group's asking the U.S. DOT to instead allow haulers to drive up to 15 hours with a 16-hour on-duty period following a 10-hour consecutive rest period. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines. And with that, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the care of calves as we move into the fall and early winter. One of the things we really need to be prepared for as we head into the fall season is how we're going to take care of our small calves. One of the most important things for these small calves is that the hair coat is dried soon after birth. You know, we have to understand that even at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, calves can encounter cold stress. So as you think about that, in an environment that feels pretty nice to us can actually be kind of chilly to that newborn calf. So getting that hair coat dried quickly is very important. Use of warming boxes and other things are very helpful in doing that. In some cases, we might choose to use calf blankets for a few days, and that can be a way that we keep the calf from being chilled at birth. Why is that important? Well, we want this young calf to have a good start. And if they're going to have a good start, we need to try to remove as much stress as we can. One of the major stresses they often face is the fact that they're in an environment that's much cooler than what they have been used to. So trying to keep that hair coat dry, the use of blankets to help the animals from being chilled is a very important first step in what we need to do to make sure that they remain healthy during the first couple of weeks of life. Now, some other things to consider once we get past that. Obviously, these calves need a dry environment and good bedding so that they, again, are not cold stressed. Cold stress can be a major factor in reducing their ability to fight off disease. So as we think about that, the next thing that we really need to think about is the nutrition program. What are you going to be feeding these calves during the liquid feeding program? I know many people choose milk replacer, and that can be an excellent choice. But again, making sure that we're providing enough nutrients through that milk replacer is critical. Sometimes on our farms, and again in a cost-saving measure, during the summertime we will feed a milk replacer that has a lower percent fat. However, as we move into a fall and winter season, we need to change that. The animal needs more calories to fight off cold stress. As a result of that, we need to increase the percentage of milk fat that's found in that milk replacer if we've reduced it for the summertime feeding period. Secondly, many of our producers are choosing to feed either whole milk or milk from cows during the transition. In other words, the colostrum is fed as the first feeding, but then for the next few milkings, we have transition milk that might be utilized in the calf feeding area. This milk contains a little bit higher percentage fat than what we might find in milk replacer or even in whole milk. Also contains some other nutrients that are also valuable to the calf. So as you consider your milk feeding program, you might want to look at maybe splitting things in your calf feeding program. Maybe for the first 3 to 4 weeks, you feed whole milk or you feed transitional milk. Maybe you only do it for 2 weeks, but for the initial couple weeks of the calf's life, you do something different. Maybe it's a higher fat milk replacer that you feed during that time. Then transition the calves to a lower percent milk replacer or a different liquid feeding program as they hit, say, 2 to 4 weeks of age would be appropriate in most cases. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider their early calf management practices as well as the feeding program that they use for liquid feeding to their young dairy calves.
Thanks, Mike, and this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now. Once again, we're visiting with wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee, on another aspect of wildlife management. This time, Charlie, one approach to deer hunting and deer control that we haven't talked of all that frequently, bow hunting as a preferred approach, noting that the archery season for deer is now underway in Kansas.
Yes, and we certainly have a lot of people that partake in the archery season in Kansas. Bow hunting is proposed frequently as a deer harvest management option in some suburban or urban areas because of some perceived inherent safety concerns. There may be other concerns, however, expressed about the possibility of archery equipment wounding additional deer. So there's lots of equipment options out there for bow hunters. It's important that bow hunters make informed decisions when they're purchasing and using equipment. I think we all want to promote equipment that works the most efficiently and leads to the highest percentage of deer being recovered. Higher deer recovery rates certainly is going to be a better utilization of the resource and would really lessen some of folks' objections to bow hunting.
Need to share with folks the lineup of archery equipment available, and then all of that was a subject of a study on the performance along the lines you're talking of. But what are the alternatives out there?
Well, when we talk about bow hunting, there's really kind of three types. You got the long bow, a recurve bow, and the compound bow, and those all have three main characteristics. They got a string, a pair of limbs, and a handle. The long bow is a single-piece bow, would be in traditional archery. The recurve is a bow in which the limbs curve away from the archer. And then the compound bow has eccentric pulleys and cables that allow much higher bow weights, but a lower weight at full draw. The compound crossbow also has those eccentric pulleys and cables. So there's kind of four different types. The arrows that are fired from bows and crossbows are the way techniques and equipment has evolved over time. We also have different broadhead types. Those would be in two general categories, would be a fixed broadhead type, which may have multiple cutting edges but no moving parts, and a mechanical broadhead type, which might have some moving parts, blades that expand upon contact with the animal, and typically would have a larger diameter cutting edge.
So this research, which you'll share today, wanted to compare and contrast these kinds of equipment in the combinations of equipment as well, and as far as how effective they are in a clean deer harvest. So what were the details of this?
This was a report that was compiled by the Natural Resource Office at a federal facility that was in Maryland. That facility was used to produce explosives, so it has very limited access, and they don't allow firearm hunting. They have a deer herd that needed to be managed and decided to establish deer management goals and see if those goals could be met with bow hunting. So they had some fairly strict requirements for the bow hunters. They must have passed the International Bow Hunter Education Program, and then they had an annual preseason shooting proficiency test. Then they were assigned blinds, and if they hit a deer, they were required to notify a hunt captain who was an employee or an agent of the Natural Resource Office, and then they had volunteers that were available to help them if they needed to track deer in order to find the deer and properly recover that animal. So they kept data for 23 years. Crossbows were not allowed for that entire length of time. In Maryland, crossbows were allowed in 2010, and mechanical broadheads were allowed in 2007. What they decided to do was kind of report on the recovery rate from deer that were taken with compound bows versus crossbows, and the recovery rate by broadhead type, whether it was a fixed blade broadhead or a mechanical blade broadhead, which some folks call expandable.
So was any of the types of bows or arrows superior in that deer recovery rate then?
The study showed that the choice of the broadhead type did affect the ability of bow hunters to recover deer, but the choice of bow type did not affect any hunter success rate. The data showed that bow hunters that used mechanical broadheads had a higher deer recovery rate over their counterparts that used fixed blade broadheads. Another consideration looking at that data showed that the use of mechanical broadheads reduced the wounding rate by half over that was realized with fixed blade broadheads, and that was a 9% versus an 18% comparison. The larger cutting width of the mechanical broadheads apparently overcomes those inherent issues with penetration or reliability of having some additional moving parts. So it seems that mechanical broadheads could facilitate a more humane harvest of deer by causing a quicker death and making hit deer easier to find. So I think the results are pretty specific and recommend that mechanical broadheads seem to be a little more efficient in allowing hunters to recover deer that they have hit.
Bow hunting in general may be an alternative compared to use of firearms in deer harvest and recovery in those areas particularly where firearms can't be used.
Yes, I think that the data that was determined with this particular compilation of information shows that definitely archery and bow hunters can be very efficient in harvesting deer. And hopefully it will open a few people's minds that this is a valid, efficient, and safe means of helping us manage white-tailed deer in locations that we have a lot of people very close to the deer herd.
Interesting information resulting from this long-term study. And Charlie, thanks for going over it with us today. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Before we go today, reminding you, check out our podcast service where you can access this broadcast on your mobile device every weekday. To get that rolling, go to agtoday.net, agtoday.net. Meantime, thanks for listening in right here today. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.